Okay, so this is going to be the introduction to Deer Hunting with Jesus by Joe Bageant, this book. Introduction. On the morning of November 2nd, 2004, millions of Democrats arose to a new order. Smoke from neoconservative campfires hung over all points southward and westward. The hairy fundamentalist Christian hordes, the redneck blue-collar legions, and other cultural Visigoths stirred behind distant battlements. In university towns across the country, in San Francisco, Seattle, and Boulder, in that bluest of blue strongholds, New York City, and in every self-contained, oblivious corner of liberal America where a man or woman can buy a copy of The Nation without special ordering it, Democrats sank into the deepest kind of Prozac-proof depression. What, they wondered, happened out there in the heartland? The iconographic one they'd seen on television and in magazines, the one bright with church spires, grange halls, stock car races, and community heritage festivals. And why had the working class so plainly voted against their own interests? 2 years later, Democrats regained, for the time being at least, a majority, and liberals have had time to contemplate what they see as the deeply uncultured mob that trounced them in 2004. They have watched panel discussions on PBS. They have argued about where political strategy went wrong. But the one thing the thinking left and urban liberals have not done is tread the soil of the Goth, subject themselves to the unwashed working-class America, to that church-going, hunting and fishing, Bud Light drinking, provincial America. To the people who cannot and do not care to locate Iraq or France on a map, assuming they even own an atlas, few educated liberals will ever find themselves sucking down canned beer at the local dirt track or listening to the preacher explain the infallibility of the Bible on every known topic from biology to the designated hitter rule, or attending a words night at a Christian school, or getting drunk to Teddy and the Starlight Ramblers playing C&W at the Eagles Club. Well, ho ho ho, welcome to my world. Here in my hometown, Winchester, Virginia, it is impossible to avoid the America that carried George W. Bush to victory in 2004 and would again elect someone else just as unsavory, even if they turn on Bush like feral dogs in these last days of his attempted imperial reign, even if he is hauled out of the Oval Office in custody. Winchester is one of those southern places where the question of whether Stonewall Jackson had jock itch at the Battle of Chancellorsville still rages right alongside evolution, gun control, abortion, and whether Dale Earnhardt Jr. is half the driver his daddy was. The area is solidly fundamentalist, Christian, and neoconservative, steeped in the gloomy, ultra-Protestant assumption that man is an evil, worthless thing from birth and goes downhill from there. If nothing else, though, Winchester is a marvelous place from which to observe this nation, where the oldest and the newest America, and all the vestigial mutant stages in between, exist in spittle-flecked living color. Winchester is foremost a working-class town, despite the yuppie monster bellums springing up on 7-acre plots all around it, and the prettying up of the old town core as a historic district. You can make light bulbs at the GE plant, you can make styrene mop buckets at Rubbermaid, or you can bus cartons, stack product, and cashier at Walmart and Home Depot. But whatever you do, you're likely to do it as a team assembler at a plant or as a cashier standing on a rubber mat with a scanner in your paw. And you're going to do it for a working man's wage, for about $16,000 a year if you're a cashier, $26,000 if you're one of those team assemblers. Yet this place from which and about which I am writing could be any of thousands of communities across the United States. It is an unacknowledged parallel world to that of educated urban liberals, the world that blindsided them in November 2004, and the one they will need to come to understand if they are ever to be politically relevant again. By what authority am I entitled to rant in these pages? None, really, other than being the native son of a working America gone downhill. That realization came in 1999 when, after a 30-year absence, I decided to move back to my hometown and saw the creeping and creepy way the lives of my working-class family members, my neighborhood, and my community had been devalued and degraded by the forces against which left-leaning people have always rallied. the same forces my family and town so solidly backed in the voting booths. My part of Winchester, the North End, contains the most hardcore of the town's working class neighborhoods, where you're more likely to find the $20,000 a year laborer and the $14,000 a year fast food worker. I grew up here. My dad worked at a gas station here, and my mom worked at a since demolished textile mill whose rattling looms were the round-the-clock backdrop of our lives. I smoked my first cigarette here and married a poor white girl from down the street. My forebears are buried here, and all my ghosts are here. The ghosts of 250 years of ancestors, the ghosts of old love affairs, and the ghost of my youth. I know everyone's last name, and whose daddy was who, and who boinked whom when they were in high school. So when I moved back after 30 years out west, it was as if my heart was back where it belonged, which lasted about 3 months. It didn't take too many visits to the old neighborhood tavern or to the shabby church I attended as a child to discover that here in this neighborhood, in the richest nation on earth, folks are having a hard go of it, and it's getting harder. 2 in 5 residents of the North End do not have a high school diploma. Here, nearly everyone over 50 has serious health problems, credit ratings rarely top 500, and alcohol, Jesus, and overeating are the 3 preferred avenues of escape. These days, the neighborhood looks as if it was painted by Edward Hopper, then bleakly populated with gangstas, old men with 40-ounce malt liquor bottles, hardworking single moms, and kids on cheap, busted plastic tricycles. The city government tries to cover the property with ordinances that make the local slumlords paint the exteriors of the rentals, but paint can only cover so much. Wedged between the old railroad station and the Confederate cemetery, the North End neighborhood was once the redneck buffer for white Winchester. Everyone in town knew which streets represented the color line. Those same streets are becoming Black and Latino now, and you can see the families who live there going through the same struggles for modest respectability in these rental properties as the working poor whites who owned them in the 50s and early 60s, when it was possible to buy a house on a low-wage working couple's income. They place foil-covered flower pots on porches, and they crisply cut the earth along sidewalks with lawn edging tools, as if the red clay pounded by the feet of the neighborhood kids were ever going to produce enough grass to threaten the walkways. They do the very things white working people once did to proclaim, "We might be poor, but we ain't coloreds." Admittedly, my people are a little seedier than most. This is, after all, the South, albeit the northernmost point of the South. But their needs, affordable health care, a living wage, steady employment, affordable rents, and having some money for retirement, differ from those of all working-class Americans only in degree. There is no sharp dividing line between the working poor renters in this neighborhood and the working-class home owners in the treeless, T-board-sided, modular home suburbs, here and everywhere else. The working class here, in what they are now calling the heartlands, all the stuff between the big cities, exists on a continuum ranging from complete insecurity to the not quite complete insecurity of having a decent but endangered job. It is a continuum extending from the apathy of the poorest to the hard-edged anger of those with more to lose, which ain't a lot, brother, when your household income hovers around $30,000 or $35,000 with both people working. Many are working poor but kid themselves that they are middle class, partly out of pride and partly because of the long-running national lie that most Americans are middle class. Being born lower class and working in America makes some of us, probably most of us, class conscious for life. Consequently, a good deal of this book is about class in America, especially the class from which I sprang, the bottom third of Americans constituting the unacknowledged working class poor, conservative, politically misinformed or oblivious, and patriotic to their own detriment. Not that I am presently poor. In the course of the circuitous journey between leaving Winchester, penniless and dumber than tree bark, and returning at age 53, a modestly successful journalist and editor, I'm now approximately a member of the middle class and one of the liberals at whom I so often poke fun. But a person's roots do not disappear just because he or she managed to narrowly cross the class lines that the American national storyline claims do not exist. And what I see is that my people, the working folks in the old neighborhood, though they own more electronic gadgets and newer cars, are faring worse than when I left in quality of life and basic security. And then there are those who have joined the growing permanent underclass in America. You see them everywhere. For example, I'm standing in the checkout line at one of the most low-rent supermarket chain stores, Food Lion, watching the fellow in front of me, Eddie Coins, receive his change with nicotine-stained fingers and stuff it into the breast pocket of his shirt. His wife is telling the clerk how her church rallied to buy her and Eddie a secondhand truck after theirs was repossessed. It needs a spare tire, but we can come up with that. Praises be to him, exclaims the clerk, as if God had come down with a 5-piece band and personally delivered that 1990 Toyota himself. Obviously, they are all born again. The wife grabs up her purchases, a 6er of Diet Pepsi, a carton of Little Debbie cakes, then moves on toward the door. Behind me are 4 or 5 other customers who could be their doubles. Overweight, bad teeth, cheap clothing, and looking as though they've been shot at and missed and shit at and hit, each of them with his or her own assortment of money, health, and legal problems. I'm sure of it. I know them. I know which ones cannot get full-time hours at the plant, and I know which one's kid has a dope problem, as she calls it, and was busted for OxyContin, the poor man's heroin. The clerk is not doing much better. I've seen her make purchases with food stamps as she goes off shift. Every one of them has worked all his or her life and lost ground for the past 25 years by middle American standards. The 20% of Winchester who can honestly be called middle class shop at the more upscale Martins, not here at this end of town, where you cannot buy an avocado or a leek, whole grain bread or baguette, or even seltzer water. When the middle class citizens of Winchester, or of the new suburbs of America, the 20% or so of Americans whose lives mostly close resemble media images of the middle class, do cross paths with these struggling workers, they do not often recognize them as struggling. That smiling, wise old fellow in the orange vest in the pipe department at the local Home Depot, the one who knows everything there ever was to know about plumbing, is limping around at age 67 on bad knees and has 2 bone-grafted discs earned through a life in construction labor. He is working solely to purchase heart medicine and the private insurance he must have if he doesn't want to lose hospital bills, the run-down bungalow He is working solely to purchase heart medicine and the private insurance he must have if he doesn't want to lose to hospital bills the rundown bungalow he and his wife bought in 1964, the one that is now in such a bad neighborhood that only the slumlords ever make an offer for it. But even not much. He's been losing ground for 25 years. If you had lived his hard-working life and had a philosophy of never wanting any handout from the government, you would be conservative. By conservative, I did not mean a wild-eyed neocon. I mean that you must be cautious and traditional enough to vote for the man who looks strong enough to keep housing values up, to destroy your unseen enemies abroad, and to give God a voice in national affairs. The problem is that neither the old fellow at Home Depot nor the rest of us are living and working in 1956 and voting for Eisenhower. The media and politicians used to call people like the man in the orange vest the traditional working class. They were the ones who came home from the Korean War and proudly built all those 1,100 square foot faux Cape Cod aluminum-sided bungalows across America. Now these working people, both young and old, mostly whites with only a high school diploma, are nameless, except for the most obviously worst off who do have a name, white trash. These are families with 2 working spouses and a couple of kids who in 2005 were still trying to crack $35,000 and who still make up 24% of American workers, at least 35 million by the government's own count. To be white and poor or just making it is a paradox in America. Whites, especially white males, are supposed to have an advantage they exploit mercilessly. Yet slightly over half of all the poor people in the United States are white. Poor whites outnumber all poor minorities combined. Black poverty consumes a larger percentage of Black society, to be sure, but that does not negate the fact that there are at least 19 million poor and working poor whites, and their numbers are growing. By the way, most poor people work. About half find employment for at least half the year. Public assistance accounts for only 1/4 of the income of poor Americans. Beyond that, the distinction between poor and working poor may well be a meaningless moral distinction shaped by the Protestant work ethic. Poor is poor, whether you have to work for your poverty or not. In fact, as of this writing, according to the 2005 Census Bureau data, poor whites are the only group that is both growing in number and getting poorer. Everyone else is pretty much stuck, regardless of the Bush administration's crowing about fractional rate changes. Still, the myth of the power of white skin endures, and so does the unspoken belief that if a white person does not succeed, his or her lack of success can be due only to laziness. But just like Black and Latino ghetto dwellers, poor and laboring whites live within a dead-end social construction that all but guarantees failure. Even well-meaning educated liberals have a difficult time with white poverty and semi-poverty. If they recognize it, they usually fail to grasp its scale. If they do acknowledge the scale of it, they are often mocked by minority anti-poverty groups. The available anti-poverty funding that exists is jealously guarded by the groups receiving it. They do not want to see it spread even thinner than it already is. Who can blame them? But are poor whites any better off than poor blacks? And does the fact that most of the super rich are white help poor whites any more than the fact that most millionaire rappers are black help poor blacks? Minority advocates can get the poverty rate, that ludicrous federal guideline of less than subsistence income, of blacks down to 8%, or you get the poverty rates of whites up to 24%. It doesn't matter a gnat's ass worth, because you will still be talking about a raft of folks who are in deep trouble and for whom all the talk about poverty statistics in the world by university researchers does not one iota of good. Universal access to a decent education, however, would lift the lives of millions over time, especially considering that many of the worst aspects of poverty stem from the intellectual bareness and brutality of the environment. I can remember my father chastising me for reading art books with Rubens' nudes on the cover. Dirty pictures, he called them. And I can remember my mother asking me if I was queer after I spent a whole day charcoal sketching from Michelangelo's David. Never experiencing the life of the mind scars entire families for generations. My dad was a working man with an 8th grade education, the same as my mother, who worked in textile mills and garment factories. The whole time I was growing up, I never once considered college until finally, years after I'd left home, the last shutters of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society thrust the opportunity on my class and generation. It is a class thing. If your high school dropout daddy busted his ass for small bucks and never read a book, and your mama was a waitress, chances are you are not going to grow up to be president of the United States, regardless of what your teacher told you. You are going to be pulling down $8 an hour at shift work someplace and praying for overtime to pay the heating bill. And you're going to be pitted against your fellow worker and 100 new immigrants on the other side of town to hang on to that job. And you're going to draw the inescapable conclusion that it's every man for himself. Solidarity be damned. The much-needed $8 comes first. Meanwhile, if you believe the national storyline, all these nameless competing working folks constitute some great American middle class. But the fact is, we are a working class country. If we define working class simply as not having a college degree, then fully 3/4 of all Americans are working class. Class, however, is defined not in terms of income or degrees, but in terms of power, especially regarding labor power. If you define working class in terms of power, bosses who have it and workers who don't, at least 60% of America is working class, and the true middle class, the journalists, professionals, and semi-professionals, people in the management class, etc., are not more than 1/3 at best. Leaving aside all numbers, working class might be defined like this. You do not have power over your work. You do not control when you work, how much you get paid, how fast you work, or whether you will be cut loose from your job at the first shiver on Wall Street. Working class has not a thing to do with the color of your collar, and not nearly as much to do with your income as most people think, or in many cases even with whether you are self-employed. These days, the working class consists of truck drivers, cashiers, electricians, medical technicians, and all sorts of people conditioned by our system not to think of themselves as working class. There are no clear lines, which is one reason why the delusion of a middle-class majority persists. About the only person I know trying to make Americans understand this is the economist, writer, and activist Michael Zweig. Oh my god. Zweig? Zweig, at the State University of New York at Stony Brook. According to Zweig, a truck driver who owns his own rig may or may not possibly be a member of the middle class, but a truck driver who works for a shipping company is working class. A self-employed electrical contractor is not a small business person or an entrepreneur. He is a skilled worker whom construction companies refuse to hire because they do not want to pay Social Security or workers' comp or health insurance for employees. Instead, they contract with him, and he assumes the cost of those programs and takes orders from a manager and shuffles through the farce that he is one of America's ever-growing crop of dynamic, self-employed entrepreneurs. Furthermore, Zweig reminds us even doctors and professors are losing control of their workday, although to earn over $1,000 a day, most of us would be happy to relinquish quite a bit of control to HMOs and university administrations, and the hollowing out of the middle class promises to make the working class even larger and working poor people poorer. One can easily imagine the professors going on strike when they are forced to teach classes again, but our self-employed electrical contractor is not about to resist the system, not with MasterCard on his back and a 3,000 Home Depot tab for tool replacement and materials for the next job. Besides, who is offering to back him up if he resists, which he has no idea of how to go about doing? From my own experience organizing press workers and delivery people at a newspaper, I know that it takes a few outsiders, experienced, educated, left-leaning people to organize local labor in the anti-union regions of this country, if for no other reason than to navigate the complex laws designed to thwart unions. But outsiders, they used to be called agitators, bring something else with them. They bring themselves as models of empowerment, and if they are good at what they do, they bring backbone. And the days before the spine of the labor movement was crushed, back when you could be a gun owner and a liberal without any conflict, members of the political left supported these workers, stood on the lines taking beatings at the plant gates alongside them. Now there's practically no labor movement, and large numbers on the left are comfortably ensconced in the true middle class, which is only about 20% to 30% of Americans, as we shall see. From that vantage point, liberals currently view working whites as angry, warmongering bigots, happy pawns of the American empire, which begs the question of how they came to be that way if they truly are. Meanwhile, we have what my people see as the liberal elite, the people still living the American dream and relative economic safety. Yet the liberal elite, and verily they are an elite group, don't think of themselves as elitist. Overwhelmingly white and college educated, they live among clones of themselves. As far as they know, American life is about money, education, home ownership, and professionally useful friends. How can one blame them? Conditioning is everything, and how could they fail to believe their own experience or what they see every day, all of which suggests that their privileges are natural and deserved. At the other end of the melanin and money meter are blacks, and alongside them are low-earning, uneducated rednecks, bred from generations of low-earning, uneducated rednecks, clustered in the whole neighborhoods of the same. The middle class, both liberals and conservatives, are utterly dependent on my people, the great throng of the underpaid, undereducated, and overworked. This is not whining, just a simple statement of fact. We are the reason inflation stays low and the private retirement accounts of the middle class have remained stable. Meanwhile, the working class is entirely dependent on the Social Security program, which eventually will be slashed and privatized by some backdoor method by the ownership class in order to boost, in a wonderfully self-serving loop, the stock market, which serves primarily the upper middle class and the upper classes. It is easy for conservatives who were born into the upper quarter and have never needed entitlement programs to be against them. For liberals born in that quarter, being against them is only slightly harder, morally speaking. You endorse affirmative action at the cocktail party, then bitch afterwards about Shanisa and Marta leaving streaks on the granite countertop when she wiped up the party slobs. No Democrat or lefty seems to grasp that much of the working class's theocrats' eagerness to join the corporatists at putting the liberal yuppies in their place is revenge-based. Working class people can perceive the upper middle class snobbery towards them, but that snobbery emerges only when the rough edges of the two worlds rub up against each other. Most of the time, the true middle and upper classes are scarcely aware that real working people exist. To wit, it is one hell of a comment on the American class system when I can get paid to write and speak publicly about the 45 million or so working Americans who are all around us, citizens of this nation who have been fixing America's cars and paving its streets and waiting on its tables. As a perfectly decent liberal New York City editor told me, it is as if your people were some sort of exotic, as if you're from Yemen or something. I don't mean to reinforce the false neocon-generated label of brie-eating, microbrew-sucking, Volvo-driving wimps. I've done all those things and worse, except for the unaffordable Volvo. Besides, if liberal America has been somewhat too smug of late, my working-class brethren have been downright stupid to be so misled by the likes of Karl Rove, Pat Robertson, and the phony piety of George W. Bush. The fact is that liberals and working people need each other to survive the growing economic calamity delivered to us by the regime that promised to run this country like a business. Sooner or later, despite the Democrats' win in the 2006 midterm elections, the left must genuinely connect face-to-face with Americans who do not necessarily share all of their priorities, especially with Americans who have not been voting, if the left is ever to be relevant again to a working America. If the left is not about class equity, what is it about? With that in mind, I would like to take the reader someplace closer to the lives of America's homegrown working folks than our media ever ventures, closer to those whose kids' high school trip is to Iraq, who are 2 paydays away from homelessness, yet in their pride cling to the notion that they are middle-class Americans. In what might be viewed as a series of closely linked essays, we start off with a night at Royal Lunch, one of the local taverns, where you will meet Dottie, Dink, and the other good working folks who populate this book. Then it's on to meet local employees of Rubbermaid and take a hard look at the ways globalism plays out for people in this town. In Chapter 3, we buy a mobile home, and in the next chapter, we visit the heartland gun culture that few gun control advocates ever set foot in. After a get-together with the inhabitants of the gun culture, it becomes apparent why the anti-gun forces in America can never win. These Americans love their guns for perfectly legitimate, if not always comforting, cultural reasons that go clear back to that battle-hardened swarm of Calvinist border Scots who came to America, happy enough to kill off the feathered and painted godless heathen. Over the past few years, we have watched their descendants fighting in Iraq, having their guns and bodies blessed by attending clergy, as they go forward to scrub yet another nuisance from the path of democracy and righteousness. To understand why they believe God might want such a thing done, you are invited to read Chapter 5, in which we meet some Christians who want a theocratic state. In Chapter 7, we visit a nearby small town, one of America's many cheap labor and nursing home gulags that nobody is talking about these days, where local karaoke singer Dottie ends up. This opens a can of worms about how married women who worked are cheated out of their Social Security dollars, and how fake nonprofit hospitals dominate American healthcare, failing to help uninsured and low-income sick people while spending billions to put small local hospitals out of business and open multi-million-dollar spas and fitness centers. And in the last chapter, I try to answer this question. How in the hell can it be that one part of the nation knows so little about the lives of the other? What great illusion in the theater of American life holds us so captive that we cannot even see those around us, much less persuade them not to vote against their own best interests, or ours. I call this illusion the American hologram. This book is written from a changing town in Virginia, but this class of mine, these people, the ones who smell like an ashtray in the checkout line, devour a carton of Little Debbie's at a sitting, and praise Jesus for a truck with no spare tire, exist in every state in our nation. Maybe the next time we on the left encounter such seemingly self-screwing, stubborn, God-obsessed folks, we can open to their trials, understand the complexity of their situation, and even have enough solidarity to pop for a cheap retread tire out of our own pockets, simply because that would be a kind thing to do, and surely would make the ghosts of Joe Hill, Eleanor Roosevelt, and Mohandas Gandhi smile.